PlayStation made about 2.7% of its entire income from porting its games to PC. The number is actually quite significant, but something seems to be missing from the entire conversation. And what is missing from the entire conversation is that 2.7% in terms of their entire revenue. How much of that particular 2.7% was margin within its own category? Let me explain. Game Over 30 does a really solid job in actually pointing and breaking this stuff down. He says, and I made a video about this, but I think this is going to be important because you can pull out the educational piece here. He says, why would a company continue to support cross-platform releases when it's a small percent of their revenue? And then he answers, because those revenue streams are significantly higher margin than main revenue drivers. In essence, even though they made 2.7% in terms of that revenue, the amount of margin that they realized from the revenue that came from that source was significantly higher on a percentage basis. For instance, let's say they sold 600 million. Let me use Game Over 30's example over here. Shout out to Game Over 30, sir. Your example is pristine, so I must borrow it. So let's say they made $600 million in total from the games that they sold on PC. Because these games, their development costs were already made in profits. The moment God of War Ragnarok sold 15 million units, it had made all its money back and profits. They took some of those profits and pretty much commissioned a port. So that basically pays for itself. And every single dollar that is made from PC on Ragnarok, in terms of the 70%, is just pure profit. So let's just say they went ahead and make about 70+%. That's Game Over 30's numbers. It's his example, by the way. Let me go ahead and show you right here. He says, let's say in this particular margin on $600 million in revenue is 70%, just for the sake of the example. So their earnings, in this case, is going to look like this, about $420 million. So if the margin from the 2% is actually about 70%, PlayStation has no reason to go ahead and abandon it. Now, let me give you my analogy, which I think is one that is probably much more fitting in this particular scenario. Every YouTuber that talks about, so far that I know, the console market and all of the above, that is not full-time in this particular enterprise, has a day job of some kind that they would admittedly tell you makes them more money than YouTube. If not every one of them, I think majority of them. Because I do YouTube, so I can already look at numbers and I can almost tell you that that's the way. But they still keep doing YouTube, even though YouTube doesn't make them as much money overall. Why do they keep doing YouTube? Those of you who may be listening to them, and if you listen to them tell you that this 2.7% is a small thing, ask them and say, but why do you still do YouTube? Even though YouTube overall, right, in terms of your overall revenue, is a small piece of it. The reason they're still doing YouTube is because YouTube is high margin. They don't have to actually drive to their YouTube studio. It's in their house. They don't have to actually go ahead and do anything extemporaneous. They just talk in a microphone. They find a corner to hang a camera, put a desk and a computer to make their content, and voila, they're going. So that particular margin that YouTube yields them from talking into a microphone is significantly higher than pretty much them driving to work, putting in all that effort, getting up in the morning, depending on when you work, maybe a night shift and so on and so forth, to realize all of that. That's one of the reasons I think that makes a logical, explanation as to why many of them are still going to do YouTube if they even care about the money anyways. But there's nothing wrong with the ad revenue, right? They're not against it. They're not against the super chats. They're not against the support and members joining their channels. Right? That's why they still do it. Because there's not really as much of a burden to go ahead and execute on it. PlayStation, at this moment in time, is even showing their hand that they want to release one, at least, single-player tentpole game every year. Why? Because collecting 30% from many more people, right, is higher margin in, comparison to a risky single-player game. So this cadence is going down. The live service game, which is something that they're continuing to basically go ahead and, pursue to an extent, right, is also another play that they're using to try to see if they can pretty much strike gold. something that I think that they're 20 years late on, as they were basically using Call of Duty money to pretty much, prop themselves up in a superior position. Now that Xbox has got that Call of Duty money, what do they really have to actually show? They now have to be innovative. Valve, each year makes about, $11 billion, maybe not even much. But their margin is significantly insane. It's actually higher than PlayStation's. So for Valve, it's actually much higher margin. This is why Valve doesn't pump out single player games every year, even though they probably could. But it's significantly higher margin for Valve to collect your 30% as a developer and leverage their platform and build it and make it the best place for developers and the best place for customers to actually intersect than it is for them to go ahead and fund another $200 million project. Simple. And even if they were funding the $200 million projects, they still have to continue building their ecosystem, because the higher margin and the low risk that's involved is actually there. It's nice. That's one of the reasons, if you also go ahead and think about it, that Game Pass also makes Xbox look really good as a business, because its margins are insane. They already get their 30%. They already get their other sources of income, but that kind of income is just low effort, as subscribers continue to just put their subscriptions on roll and continue pretty much engaging in their ecosystem and bringing in money. So for a company to, in some people's eyes, to go ahead and abandon an income stream just because they think that the overall revenue from that income stream is not big enough, is people not looking at the big picture. I think that this particular categorization that Game Over 30 has put here on Twitter is quite masterful. Everyone, in my opinion, should take a look at this particular context, because without this context, you have people running around and saying this. And then here's the final one that makes it make a whole lot of sense. So let's say you take that $420 million in this example, and you divide it by the entirety, the $3.3 billion, right, that you made in total, $2.9 billion that you made from, say, your overall revenue, and then the 420 that you made from the overall PC revenue. After having added them, you're looking at 12%. 12% of earnings came from a much smaller percentage of revenue, around 2 to 3% of revenue. Point being, the higher margin revenue is a much more efficient income generator. The expense required to drive that $420 million is barely noticeable. It will be financially foolish to avoid the higher margin revenue. That's the reason almost every part-time YouTuber is in business, including the ones that tell you that it's not such a big deal. Even though YouTube doesn't make as much money, then it's nothing in comparison. But it's actually, a low cost, low expense methodology, if you think about it. All right. Thanks for watching. Talk to me in the comment section. Peace out.